Most of them knew that. It's been a while. This is sure a nice venue. And I think it's wonderful to have the opportunity to be here on a regular basis. This is nice. And I've never seen a museum anywhere like here in Athens, Alabama. I want to begin with a personal observation. I'm going to talk tonight about the circumstances that led up to Stonewall Jackson being mortally wounded in the aftermath of his greatest, the Army of Northern Virginia's greatest crime, Battle of Chancellorsville, May 2-3, 1863. And so I want to begin with a personal observation. I have never met anybody, I've never met a native-born Southerner for whom this topic does not, at least faintly, and maybe more than faintly, pull at your heartstrings. It's a hard one to get over. There's no way around it. I'm reminded, and this is not the case for native-born Northerners. Native-born Northerners, I'll show you in a minute, had great admiration for Stonewall, and some to this day. But never the emotional pull that this topic gives. There's a wonderful scene in one of the Faulkner novels where a young man from Mississippi, he's at Yale University, just moving in, and his roommate is from Ohio, and they talk a bit about the Civil War, and the young man from Mississippi tried to explain the truth behind what I've been saying. It pulls the heartstring of every native-born Southerner. And the guy from Ohio just couldn't believe it, and so finally the young man from Mississippi said, well, you have to be born here to understand it. And that's, I think, very, very true. I want to begin with the handout. The cover of the handout is the cover of the book by Robert Crick, the greatest living historian of the Army of Northern Virginia. It's a collection of essays, most of them very short. The longest chapter and the dominant chapter essay is entitled Smoothbore Volley Doing the Confederacy. And I want to talk about that word doomed for a minute. One man mortally wounded as against the vast expanse of the Southern Confederacy, as against the vast numbers of killed and wounded on both sides. But this one volley doomed the Confederacy, and I wanted to try to explain why. The Army of Northern Virginia was the only Confederate Army that had any realistic chance of winning the war, which I think would have meant bringing the North to a negotiated settlement. There are a lot of reasons why the armies in the West did not have a realistic chance of winning the war. They don't include the bravery and the courage and the privations the Army of Mississippi soldiers and Army of Tennessee soldiers showed throughout the war. There are a lot of reasons for it, but the fact emerges that the Army of Northern Virginia had the only realistic chance of bringing the North to a negotiated settlement. It was not a good chance, it was a long shot, but it was the only one we had. And when Jackson was mortally wounded, that chance vanished, just like that. There was no longer a chance. It crippled the high command of the most powerful and successful Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia. And it didn't take long for the results to show. you think immediately of Gettysburg. I don't want to get off into Gettysburg and what might have been and so on and so forth, but I will simply say that Lee said to Colonel Allen after the war, when he was president of Washington College, if I had had Stonewall Jackson with me at Gettysburg, I believe we would have won. Case closed. Going to the handout, the first page of the handout, past the cover, is evidence, I think, of what I said about the northern states and the northern people, at least having an admiration for Jackson and for Lee. And here's proof from the middle 1930s. This is a United States Post Office commemorative stamp from the late 1930s. Lee and Jackson, and in the background, Stratford Hall, where Lee was born. We were that kind of a country then that a stamp like this could be issued to the general approval of all in the country, whether or not the circumstances surrounding Jackson's death, whether or not they pulled at your heartstrings or not. The native Southerners, I think they do. But the admiration as a country for two great Americans is here on display. The United States stamp, 1936. And the coin below it is earlier. The coin below it is 1927. This is a picture of a Stonewall Jackson 50-cent piece. And this is legal tender in the United States. Legal tender in the United States. It's sometimes called the Stone Mountain 50-cent piece because it has, this is the drawing. This is the carving. This is a replica in silver. It's a carving of the Stone Mountain memorial. And this wasn't a trinket. It wasn't a souvenir thing. You'd spend it. And that's the kind of country we were at that time, where admiration freely abounds, and not necessarily the emotional tone that the terrible events I'm going to try to describe come. The second page of the handout is a chronology. I always think these are helpful to understand a complicated subject, just to break down the dates and get the sequences right. There are three dates of the chronology that I want to begin with, and one is the fourth date down, May 25, 1862. Lee and Jackson operated as a team for the first time on display here in winning the First Battle of Winchester. It capped the success of Stonewall Jackson's Valley campaign. To wage that campaign, to be able to wage that campaign, Jackson had to depend upon Robert E. Lee, a man whom he had never met. Lee and Jackson never met until June 23, a little bit further down the chronology. You'd have thought that they would have met in Mexico or somewhere along the line, but no, they had never met. They were different armies in the Mexican War, and after the Mexican War, Jackson resigned his commission and began teaching at the Virginia Military Institute. Lee stayed on. They had never met, yet Lee was willing, without a command. At this point, Lee commands nothing. He's in command of a desk. And that's it. He's a staff officer in the White House. Lee found a way to get troops to Jackson that he needed to fulfill his mission there, which concluded successfully with the First Battle of Winchester. Lee was not there. As I say, they're not going to meet until close to the end of June of '62. Jackson's orders in the Shenandoah Valley from the War Department, not from Lee. Lee could issue no orders. Jackson's mission in the Shenandoah Valley was, to put it very shortly, pin down and do not let leave the federal troops, don't let them leave. The federal troops who are already in the Shenandoah Valley, pin them down, make it impossible for them to leave, because they cover the approaches to D.C. And if they join in the main theater of operations, which is McClellan's attempt to take Richmond, the balance will be, it's already heavily tipped in their favor. It'll be just too heavily tipped in their advance, to their disadvantage. There was a pattern. Lee went out on a limb to get Jackson 7,000 men that he needed. There was a pattern to every order Jackson received, or in this case, enablement that Jackson received from Lee, to fulfill the orders to the exact full. Don't let them leave the Shenandoah Valley. Done. But Jackson will always go a step beyond what Lee's orders were, in a way that Jackson thought Lee would approve were he standing right next to him on the battlefield in question. And Jackson explained it very clearly in a letter to his friend. He said, I will hold the Shenandoah Valley. I will hold the country. But I'm going to prepare, it's not going to just be limited to holding Union troops here. I want to draw more Union troops here, to suck more Union troops away from this ongoing siege of Richmond, and bring them here, and we can deal with them. Orders fulfilled, step beyond, and Lee thoroughly approved of it, as he will all the way down the line. Thoroughly approved of that action, going beyond his orders. I think it's amazing that they were already a team that could function at that very high level without ever having met. And without Lee having a field command of any kind. Yet it was a team, and it functioned very, very smoothly all the way through. And let's take the next step to June 23, 1862. June 23, 1862. When Lee had neutralized, when Joseph E. Johnston, commanding the Confederate Army at Richmond, had at least attempted to neutralize McClellan's threat. At the Battle of Seven Pines, he was terribly wounded, almost killed. At which point, June 1, Jefferson Davis made the most inspired decision that he made during the war, and that was to appoint Robert E. Lee to command the Army, the main Confederate field army in Richmond. Among Lee's now orders, or really suggestions, among Lee's first suggestion to Jackson was that he bring his Valley Army to Richmond and see it melded into the Army of Northern Virginia, into a fighting force that could complete the job against McClellan and then take on all comers in the future. And Jackson was glad to join Lee, and he reached Richmond himself. Jackson came ahead of his men. He reached Richmond on the 23rd of June, 1862, and that day met Lee at his headquarters for the very first time. Two men had ever laid eyes on one another, let alone shaking hands with one another. And from that point on, the two are in harness together. Jackson's best biographer says that as it goes on through the string of victories now, Second Manassas, Sharpsburg, a drawn battle, great victory at Fredericksburg, greatest of them all at Chancellorsville. That pattern of Jackson's continued. He would fulfill Lee's orders to the utmost and then go beyond in a way that Lee would approve, Jackson believed, were he here. Jackson thought of strategy in that way, and Robert E. Lee did as well. And that's really the bind that holds them together. They shared a strategic vision. For example, if you look at this long string of victories after they first met, Second Manassas, drawn battle at Sharpsburg, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, each one of these victories left Lee and Jackson equally frustrated, particularly the Battle of Fredericksburg. Why? Well, because the battlefield victory could not be followed up in a way that Jackson thought was natural, in a way that was natural to him. It could not be followed up to bring about what would win the war, and that was a decisive follow-up, an annihilation of the Union Army, a capture of the Union Army. Those battles were designed to do that, and each time they did not. So these victories have been somewhat empty in Lee's estimation and Jackson's estimation. They didn't complain. They didn't make a federal case out of it, but each felt that with victories like this, we ought to be getting closer to ending the war, and we don't seem to be, even though we are racking up these great defensive battles in Richmond. And that takes us to Chancellorsville. When I gave Melissa the sheets to, I won't get the point of these. When I gave Melissa the sheets to staple together for y'all's handout, I gave her some of the sheets in the wrong order. So rather than number the maps as we go, I'm going to hold up the map that I wish you would be on at that moment. And the first one I'm holding up is the first one of the three. It's the first one of the three. And that is the overall scheme of the Battle of Chancellorsville. Joseph Hooker was in charge of the Union Army of the Potomac at this point, taking over after the disaster at Fredericksburg, but taking over an intact army whose terrible losses were made good in about 14 to 24 hours, some speed like that. Hooker had a plan, and it was a good plan. He meant Lee's line of defense is the Rapidan River, running from the top left to the bottom right of your map. That's Lee's line of defense. He can't be frontally attacked. Fredericksburg proved that. So Hooker's idea was to take most of his 60,000 men and move them up the Rappahannock and then cross the river somewhere beyond Lee's far left flanks. And that would, Hooker believed, force Lee to give up the line of the Rapidan River, give up his presence in the wilderness altogether, force him to fight in an open field somewhere south of here in a battle that Hooker, with his numerical superiority, could not fail to lose. That was Hooker's plan. Lee had very little respect for Hooker, Fighting Joe Hooker. Lee called him Mr. F.J. Hooker. Not much respect meant there. Hooker's plan was a good one, and it worked. I have to say, at the beginning, it worked like a charm. He moved up the Rapidan River, crossed the river, and found himself almost squarely on Lee's left flank. At which point, two things, according to his plan, were supposed to happen. Neither did. The first thing was that once Hooker got into this Hooker got into this very advantageous position. For reasons best known to himself, he halted. He stopped. Reasons best known to himself. In every great military plan, Clausewitz told us, there is a wonderful plan, but somewhere there comes an unexpected friction where things don't work out the way they are supposed to work out. And the second thing that went wrong was when Hooker got across the river and into possession to crush Lee's flank and drive him out of the area altogether. Lee, who was supposed to pull out of fear that he couldn't withstand Hooker's coming blow, Lee did not pull out. He stayed in place. And that was truly unexpected. Hooker's army numbered about 90,000 men. The Army of Northern Virginia had 60,000 names on the roll. But of those 60,000, fully 20,000 were not with Lee. 20,000 men were with James Longstreet, foraging in eastern Virginia, Tidewater, Virginia. So Lee has about 40,000 men, and he's looking at 90,000 men, and he does not pull out. As a matter of fact, he advances 4 divisions forward to meet Hooker, left 2 at Fredericksburg in case there was another crossing there. And in this way, Hooker has surrendered the initiative, you see. Hooker has surrendered the initiative, and the initiative is what Lee and Jackson longed for, not this defensive battle, victory or not, and they were all victories, but the initiative to make something larger than this, any battle happen. The question was, with so few men, how can Lee realistically seize the initiative? How can he do that? And at this point, the answer came in the person of the cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, who commanded all of the cavalry in the Army of North Virginia. When Lee and Jackson were pondering how to take advantage of the break Hooker had given them by stopping, and wondered how we could, Stuart rode up and said that he had been scouting out beyond Lee's left and found out that Hooker's left flank was, quote, in the air. And that term, in the air, always refers to a flank of your force which is anchored on no natural boundary, is unfortified, in which the line of troops just stops, leaving the whole thing in the air and susceptible to a massive flank attack. Well, Lee saw it immediately, and Jackson did too. And they set about, well, I'll tell you in just a second what they said about. A flank attack, and now let's turn back a page, can we? No, I'm sorry. Now let's turn forward a page. A flank attack looks as easily, it looks as easily done as it is conceived. It's simplistic in its nature on a map. Forrest always called a flank attack just hitting them on the end. But a massive flank attack. Now Jackson is going to take more than half of the Confederate force with him on a 13-mile march around Hooker's left flank. He's going to ignore all the dangers, all the obstacles, all the disqualifiers that a flanking movement has, and there are a lot of them. The flanking force can get lost. The flanking force can be detected. Hooker can get in motion again and crush Lee while Jackson's out there wandering around trying to find the left flank of the Union Army. A million things can go wrong. with a flank attack. It has to be, Forrest was a master of them, and Jackson shows himself to be equally so, with much larger numbers involved. Jackson proposed to Lee, and this is the subject of the famous work of art, where Lee and Jackson are each sitting on a cracker box, with drawing out in a stick what Jackson is going to, stick in the dust, with what Jackson is going to do. And Jackson proposed to Lee, let me have 4 divisions. And Lee said, what will you leave me? And Jackson said, 2 divisions. And Lee said, well, go ahead then. They parted company on the night of the 2nd of May, and Jackson prepared for an early start on May 3rd, which turns out to be the last meeting between Lee and Jackson. As I noticed coming into the museum, on one of the display counters to my right as I came into the museum, a wonderful reproduction of the painting, The Last Meeting. The last meeting was painted during the war, and I've got 3 colored copies that I'll send around. The last meeting was painted during the war by an author named, a painter named Giulio. And on 2 of these reproductions, Giulio's picture is on the back side. This is the last meeting, and it used to hang in very, very many houses of native-born Southerners. It's had an amazing history in of itself, how it had ever survived, what it went through to make it through the years. One of Stephen D. Lee's staff officers, former staff officers, found it in a Memphis pawn shop in the 1890s and saw it for what it was, and set it, at least on firm ground as far as its survival is concerned. I want you to look at the painting, not just for the people. I want you to look particularly at the horses. Lee's horse, Traveler, is in the statuesque pose that every victorious general's horse is portrayed in, going back to Rome. Victorious general, the horse looks like that.
Looks like it.
The victorious general is mounted on he is in a classical pose. But something, now look at Little Sorrel, Jackson's horse, something is terribly wrong with Jackson's horse. You look at that pose, that ungainly pose, and that wide staring eye, and signs that he's been pawing at the earth. And the artist did that purposely, and no one ever asked him or thought to know why he did that purposely. And our best answer, I think the best answer, comes from a fictional work published in our lifetime by Robert Adams called Traveler. And in this book, it's after the war, Traveler is recounting his experiences with his master and during the war as he understood it. And Traveler said to the cat he was talking about the war to, that Little Sorrel said to him, Traveler, I don't want to make this march. I do not want to make this march. Something terrible will happen. I don't want to make this march. But then Jackson rode off to catch up to the front of his already marching column. And Traveler said, to wind up his immersion. Traveler called Confederate generals, didn't know their names, of course, but he called them by characteristics. A.P. Hill was a great shirt. Lee was massive. Jackson was capping his eyes. He always wore that cap down, practically on the bridge of his nose. And Traveler said to himself, I think, I never see cap in his eyes or Traveler again. This was truly the last meeting. Now, if you go to this map, let's stay on the map where we are. Can we stay on the map where we are? You see that the flank attack, once Jackson got into position, he left at 5 in the morning. He wasn't in position until 4 in the afternoon. These marches take a lot of time to come to pass. But once that attack was delivered, it was a crushing attack. It rolled up the Union left flank like a blanket or a rug. It just rolled it up to panic. Civil War soldiers were very courageous with straight-on fire, even advancing across an open space against straight-on fire. But what soldiers of neither army could stand for long was firing from either flank, let alone at a more than 45-degree angle, somewhat to the rear as well. Panic is the result. And panic is contagious. And Hooker's army panicked. And it was only with great difficulty it stopped just before dark on the 3rd of May. Now, Jackson's pattern, the time has come. Obey the orders and crush the flank. Now, Jackson is going to see what can be done to turn this victory into a decisive battle of annihilation or capture. He felt that Lee would approve were he there. Jackson wanted to make a night attack. That's what it would have had to been. And it's a very difficult thing. The wilderness is pitch black. There are no lights. There is no visibility. There's too much vegetation, too much second growth trees, too many vines of every description, too many bogs. Exceedingly dangerous. But the flank attack was dangerous too. And Jackson may have thought, well, as dangerous as it will be right now at, say, 8 p.m., it's going to be that much more dangerous in the morning if they're given time to fortify. And Jackson decided, now let's go to this map now. This really isn't Melissa's fault at all. This is my fault. I gave this map in the wrong order. She typed it in the wrong order. Jackson decided, you can see Jackson on this map. He's on the orange plank road, the dark line that basically cuts the map in half. He's at the point where the orange plank road cuts through the lines of a North Carolina brigade commanded by James Lane. He's a little bit out in front. He's by himself. He's mulling over the possibilities of a further attack, turn this into something lasting. And then summons a courier. Not all of Jackson's men had been involved in the attack. He had kept 2 divisions out under A.P. Hill, maybe for just a circumstance. But he told the courier, tell A.P. Hill to pass his troops to the front and be ready for action. Do it quickly. And the courier rode off, and soon Hill joined Jackson at this point between the 2 brigades, 2 of the brigades of Lane's command, and they conferred, and then decided they would make a personal reconnaissance. They would make a personal reconnaissance. there would be two parties in the reconnaissance. There would be 10 men with Hill and 8 men with Jackson, staff officers. They would go independently of each other. They would get as close to federal lines as they could in order to hear. What they didn't want to hear was axes felling trees. That might be the decisive factor. They hoped not to hear that, but Jackson wanted a personal reconnaissance made. And so they rode off. They disappeared into the darkness. General Lane wrote about that time, as the darkness swallowed them up, the wilderness was quiet as a tomb. The only thing you could hear was the sound of whippoorwills. Both generals needed guides. Jackson asked Hill, "Are you familiar with this country?" He was from Culpeper, not far. "Are you familiar with this country?" Hill said no. So Jackson turned to one of his staff officers, Captain Boswell, his engineer, and told him to ride with Hill. Who's going to ride with Jackson? Just then, a young cavalryman, a teenager, born within a couple of hundred yards of where Lee and Hill are standing now. His name was David Kyle. He rode up, and Jackson said, "Do you know this country, young man?" And he said, Kyle replied that he was born just several hundred yards from this place. And then Jackson said to him, "Well, ride along with me then." And they began riding east on the Orange Plank Road. Kyle thought that that was a dangerous line of approach, a shooting gallery right down the road if anything should go awry, and so put Jackson's party on the parallel running mountain road. It was exactly parallel to it. Few hundred, maybe 100 yards between the roads. And they got to within earshot, which is what Jackson wanted, and he signaled a halt. And still a silent evening. They listened, they could hear distinctly the sound of axes into trees and trees coming down. They listened, Jackson listened in absolute silence, nobody said anything, for about 10 minutes, and then signaled to Kyle to lead us back on the way we came in. And Kyle said he would do that, and they started out. Let's go now to the next map. Let's go to this map. You can see on the right, on the mountain road, Jackson's party is coming back, headed west this time on the mountain road, heading to Confederate lines, when suddenly, a quiet evening night, that you could only hear whippoorwills in, suddenly all hell broke loose. What was the reason for that? Turn back a page, if you would, to this map again, and I'll show you what the reason why everything suddenly erupted into cannon fire, musket fire. Both sides were flying to each other. What caused that? Well, if you look at the North Carolinians' right flank, closer to the bottom of the page, you can see that there are little fragments down there representing Union cavalry. These are cavalry that had been cut off in the flank attack, and were now, they thought they were either abandoned or woefully lost, and they decided to try to find a way out. But instead of riding east they rode a little bit to the north, and they were encountered by an 18-year-old sergeant from the 7th North Carolina named Collins. 18-year-old, commanding the company. And Collins called out to these men, "Who goes?" And the reply came, "Friends." And Collins replied, "Of whom?" And they replied, "The Union." And Collins turned back to his men and said, "Fire." And fire was a contagion running up the whole length of the Confederate line, both ways. And it was instantly returned. You see how close the lines of battle are to each other. Instantly returned from the Union side. Limbs are coming down, shot and shell everywhere. And Jackson and his party, let's go back to where we were. Jackson and his party ride right into the middle of it, or tried not to. You see, Jackson is getting off the mountain road and trying to get to the Orange Plank Road, which at this point seems more safe than the mountain road, to make their way back. Hill's party was about 40 yards ahead of Jackson, and the first volley from the North Carolina regiment there did terrible damage to Hood's party, Hill's party. Hill was wounded. Major Boswell, whom Jackson had assigned him as a guide, was killed. Several other men were wounded. Hill stayed in the saddle and turned about and made to find Jackson's column, warn him, go no further. But by that time, Jackson's group of 8 had gone quite a bit further, and the second volley, this is the one that doomed the Confederacy, the second volley hit into Jackson's party. Understand, these men are firing at an unseen target. They're firing at sounds as much as they can be heard in this tumult. Robert Crick, whose book you have the cover of, I'll say something else about the book at the end. Crick calculated that the company that fired on Jackson's party was in the neighborhood of 60 men firing a volley. So we'll say 60. Of those 60 mini balls, 55 hit nothing. Trees buried themselves in the ground, whatever. At least 5 unaccounted for. One of them hit a man's stirrup in Jackson's party. Another hit a man's scabbard in Jackson's party. That leaves 3 bullets. And all 3 hit Jackson. 3 out of them. All 3 hit Jackson. The first lodged in his palm, which is not serious at all, except for the fact, I'll say in a second, what made it suddenly serious. The other hit him in the left forearm, and the third one to hit him very high in the shoulder. Did not sever the artery, or he would have died close immediately. Jackson could no longer, with his right hand, with a bullet lodged in his palm of his right hand, he could no longer control Little Sorrel. Remember, Little Sorrel had a premonition, apparently, about this. And he bolted, and Jackson could not control him. And it was only with the greatest difficulty. They rode through limbs coming down, and branches swatting him in the face. He was cut up terribly before he could rein Sorrel in and be brought back to what looked like, brought back to the place where he had been hit originally. at which point litter bearers were summoned once they got him off his horse. Litter bearers came. They were going to take him to 4 men. They were going to take him on the litter to Dr. Hunter McGuire's division hospital. He was Jackson's personal physician and also physician for Jackson's command. Jackson had evinced no sign of pain up to that point. But one of the litter bearers hit his foot on raised root. How many times have he done that in the forest? And went down. And Jackson toppled out of the litter, and fell onto his left shoulder, that terribly wounded him. Another litter bearer sprang forward to replace the soldier who had stumbled and was, after a few minutes, shot dead. And it repeated itself. Jackson went down again, and this time he cried. This time he cried out, and then quickly composed himself. They got him to the field hospital. Dr. McGuire instantly performed an amputation on his left arm. It was successful, and Dr. McGuire thought the prognosis was very good. The news of what had happened was taken to Lee by a member of Jackson's staff, a Mississippian named Captain J.R. Wilborn. I should have told you that as they were going in, Wilborn wrote of that moment. Wilborn wrote later, "This is no place for a lieutenant general." And that was before the witch's brew exploded. Wilborn gave the news to Lee. He said he thought Lee would break down, but of course Lee wouldn't permit himself to do that. Took it very stoically and said, "Well, Captain, let's thank God it was no worse." When Jackson came to, he wrote Lee a note, which has been lost. But this is Lee's reply to Jackson's note. "General Jackson, I have just received your note informing me that you were wounded." This language is pure Robert E. Lee. It's elegant, it's compassionate, all in one. "I cannot express my regret at the occurrence. Could I have directed events, I would have chosen, for the good of the country, to be disabled in your place. I congratulate you on the victory, which is due to your energy and skill." Jackson read the note and said, General Lee is very kind. Several days later, before the pneumonia set in, I'm not going into the medical history beyond this point, just before the pneumonia set in midweek. This was a Sunday, May 3rd was a Sunday. Things looked good until Wednesday, and then turned rapidly. Anyway, just before that, Lee summoned Jackson's favorite Army preacher. Jackson would have been a preacher if he could have been. Reverend Lacey. And General Lee wrote this to Chaplain Lacey. "Give General Jackson my affectionate regards and tell him to make haste, get well, and come back to me as soon as he can. He has lost his left arm, I have lost my right." When he died, shortly after he died, that Sunday morning, 10th, This is how Douglas Southall Freeman describes how this news came to Lee. And it's the last paragraph of the second volume of the great biography, 4-volume biography of R.E. Lee. Freeman wrote, "There was a stir outside General Lee's tent. A moment of hesitation, and then someone brought in a bit of folded paper. It contained the brief and dreadful news. In the little cottage at Guineas," you have a picture in your handout. "In the little cottage at Guineas, Jackson had roused in his bed. Jackson had roused from his restless sleep and had struggled to speak. His mind had been wandering far, who knows how far. But with an effort, in his even, low voice, he said, 'Let's pass over the river and rest under the shade of the trees.' And then, as so often on marches into the past, and then, as so often on marches into the unknown, Jackson led the way." Thank you very much. I'm happy to try to answer any questions that you might have.
Why have some of these, I don't know, on TV, because I know they love to stir up stuff, but it made it sound like, some of these stories that he was shot by Confederate officers that didn't like what he was doing, or he disciplined, or what?
People will attack anything if they don't honor the record,
right.
Honor the historical record. That's the first step.
Right. Okay.
You have to know the history before you speak out about it. I think that's what the SCD is all about. Yes, sir.
Obviously, everything stops when he's wounded, but did I hear you correctly? Prior to that, debacle, were the Union troops stationary? Were they moving? Were they what?
Stationary.
They were
They
stationary.
were building a line of log fortifications.
So they were indeed cutting down trees in order to
Yeah.
stabilize their.
We don't know what Jackson decided. We'll never know what his decision was when he told Kyle to take it back. We don't know what he decided. And we never will, of course.
He had done this kind of scouting. Of course, he's the lead general by himself. Was that normal for him, or?
As Wilborn said, it's no place for a lieutenant general. A colonel, a regimental colonel, or a brigadier general, maybe, but no, not an officer of that rank, not a major general, not a lieutenant general. It was highly abnormal. It was kind of unthought of, really.
So in that regard with Jackson really didn't trust much of anybody else. And so that would be why he went forward, because he knew he had to make that decision. And so he put himself at the risk.
In that line of thinking, he was absolutely right. That's a great observation.
And then the question also is on those Lane's troops, I think, especially those 60, they had tremendous difficulties because they had fired the shots that.
Yeah, and nobody could blame them. Nobody could blame them, but they blamed themselves. They blamed themselves to the grave. Lane himself, Collins, I think, for sure. Lane himself regretted it very much from his brigade that the shots came. But he stayed in the Army, And although no blame whatsoever could be attached to him, he was passed over for promotion again and again and again and again. He wasn't demoted, he wasn't chastised, he wasn't fussed at, but he never promoted again.
Were the two divisions that you said had not been engaged at all from A.P. Hill, did they even participate in the battle?
Oh, yeah. Well, no, they did not. They did not.
Well, the next day.
Yeah. Oh, the next day, yeah, for sure. The next day was the Titanic battle, where the two wings of Lee's army, the smaller one commanded by Lee, the larger one by Jeb Stuart taking Jackson's place, met at the clearing that is the site, that is what is called Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville was not a town. It was a clearing in the wilderness with a hotel, with a guest house. Neither one of those things. A tavern. And they met there. The two wings of the army met there, and A.P. Hill's men had a tremendous share of that fighting. They needed to. It was the second day was a hard fought battle. When it was over, Hooker skedaddled, but it was a hard fought battle. The casualties on both sides were very, very high. Lee and Jackson won the battle, lost 14,000 men. And doing it, Hooker's casualties were higher than that.
But he could afford it.
They'd be replaced by this time next week.
Anybody else?
What?
Alan? Jay?
Just a side note, at the museum in Columbia, we have now got Stonewall Jackson's epaulets from his Mexican War uniform. It's the only pair that they know of, and so they'll be on display. Yeah, Robert's got pictures. He was up there when we got to see them. So yeah, he didn't have epaulets on his Confederate uniform at any point in time, but he did in his Mexican uniform, and we had a museum donate them to us, and we've got them for a year, and they're on display. Probably first of the week they'll be out on display.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing. The rain tunic that he was wearing at the time has survived, and when I was a little boy, at least, it was on display at the Virginia Military Institute, which has done everything possible to disassociate itself from Jackson now.
Now they have?
And it's on display with the hole here and hole there. To add insult to injury, Washington and Lee College is desperately trying to get away from both of those names, Washington and Lee, and they don't want to be hooked up with Traveler anymore either. Lee is buried in the chapel that he built. Traveler was buried to the left as you go into the chapel. There's a nice plaque out there explaining the relationship. They dug it up, carried it off, and they moved 15 or 20 yards north with just a simple metal sign trailer. It's unbelievable.
Alan, you had a comment?
Just what's your opinion? They put, Lee had more or less because he was there, Jeb Stuart take over for the second day. What's your opinion that realizing he was supposed to be cavalry? I'm thinking my opinion would be he might have been the man to keep it. But yours?
Well, he was senior commander at that point. Longstreet was not there. Hill was wounded. So it fell on Stuart.
I'm talking going away from, later. Instead of going back as just being the cavalry commander, keeping command of effectively the corps.
I think he's where he needed to be. He was where, same thing I think about Forrest. He was where he needed to be. He didn't need to be anything but what he was.
Randy?
Yes.
No.
Yeah, just one little side note, since you were talking about VMI. I went to VMI also when I was a young fellow, just to see, and of course his horse was stuffed at that time, and I remember the jacket you're talking about. But what, do they still have that there at VMI?
I have not been to the museum in a long time. I remember seeing him. I remember seeing sorrel in a glass case, but I don't know.
Okay.
Sure, the statue is gone, the cannon are gone.
Say again?
The statue is gone out on the parade ground.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the cannon are gone.
Okay.
Yeah. Lee, can I say a quick word about my books?
Absolutely, go ahead.
I brought some books. I think most of y'all are familiar with